Again, Gavin Greenwalt, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Hi. So I'm Gavin Greenwalt. I do a lot of VFX stuff. I mostly concentrate on kind of CG supervision, VFX supervision, and my focus is on lighting, but I also do a lot of live action production where I'm on set, and I've been DP, cinematographer, and I've also done pretty much everything through the entire pipeline. And what I want to talk to you today is gamma. It's kind of one of those weird little things that people just try to ignore as much as they can. They ask for the number that they're supposed to type in and then go with it. And that will work most of the time. But I just kind of want to give you a behind the scenes look at what's really happening, why we use it, why it still exists, does it still need to exist, all those questions. And at the end, I'll start touching on HDR, high dynamic range, which is creeping into the games industry now with the Xbox One X and the PS4. They're all starting to introduce HDR and what it isn't, which is to say it's not those ugly, horrible photos you see all the time on Instagram. So I'm going to start off with math, because that's always the funnest thing to do. So who here passed like grade school arithmetic? Okay, great.
Some people are lying.
You're all going to be okay. Who here has ever used the curves tool in Photoshop? Great. Okay. Math can also involve drawing. So kind of one of the basic things you want to think about, the easiest way to think about lighting and color and all that nonsense in our industry is just a simple graph. So on our horizontal axis here, this is the curves tool inside of Photoshop. You should recognize it. We got 0.0, that's 0 light. And over here we have 1.0. And we're just going to type in with our pen white. Now, white isn't white, so we're also going to jump into that. That's another thing we're going to try to tease out. And up here we also have 1.0, and that's also quote unquote white. And in between the two, you usually kind of see a line that looks about like this. And that's linear color. So we're done. Not quite. Gamma started out in the very earliest days of video for a kind of obnoxious reason, not really a good one, and that was whenever you fed a signal into a television, it would apply this curve. The response curve of voltage to brightness looked something kind of like that. So all of the people who were broadcasting the early television signals, if they sent out this nice little linear line here through the airwaves, as soon as it reached the television, it would come out looking like this, which if you can do in your head slightly with Photoshop, would look very, very dark. So instead of fixing televisions all over the world, because that was hard and is all analog, this was just the way analog worked, they just compensated for it on the broadcast and did that. So that was the invention of gamma. They said our TVs are busted. They won't display a linear signal as a linear output. So we're going to invent gamma. And if you remember your 4th grade graphing classes, if you have one function that looks like this, and you multiply it by a function like this, they cancel each other out, and you get back to your nice linear light. So that's, we'll just call this 2.2, or roughly sRGB. This is pretty much what every single LCD monitor you're using is set to. And even though all of your LCD monitors don't have this curve, they are digital, so they aren't a weird analog hack to try to take a voltage signal and turn it into a picture. We still use this curve for all of our JPEGs and for your Windows desktop and for most of our output. And it's not really necessary for its original intended purpose. But that doesn't mean it's not important. It's still a good thing to have, and that gets on to the second point about gamma. So that's a historical reason we have gamma. The modern reason we have gamma is compression. So to talk about compression for a second, this isn't like zip compression, this isn't LZW or any of those other algorithms. This is just simple, basic hackery compression. Who here knows the inverse square law? Anybody? Couple hands. The lighters, okay. The inverse square law is it's simple arithmetic. If you have a light bulb, I'll put a light bulb down here. It's shining out light. Gotta get the screw on there or it won't look like a light bulb. It goes out, and as it goes out, it gets more and more spread out. So if you're putting out, let's just say this is a really dim light bulb and it's putting out 1,000 photons precisely. And we go 3 feet away. Let's just take this, let's just say this is 2 feet. We're just taking a little 2 feet cross section of this cone of light that's coming out from this light bulb. We'll say there's 1,000 photons here. Now if we keep going out to 6 feet, if you have a triangle and you change one dimension by 2, so let's say it's 3 feet, and we go twice as far as 6 feet. You just multiply all the sides of a triangle by your difference, which in this case is doubling it. So we went from our little 2-foot cross-section to a 4-foot cross-section. And why that matters is the intuitive thing when you're thinking in your head is that as light gets farther away, it just falls off linearly. You're just thinking, well, it's 2 feet away, it's going to be half as bright. You go another 4 feet away, it gets half as bright again, but that's not actually correct. If we look at this as a cross-section, here's our 2-foot square, 2 by 2. That's 4 square feet. 4 square feet. And if we take our 4 by 4, and we get the area of that, now it's 16 square feet. That's not right. Foot squared. There we go. So even though we've just doubled the distance, what's actually happened is the light is now being spread out over 4 times as much surface area. And what that would look like on a curve is something like this. So every time you double the distance from a light bulb, it gets a quarter as bright. So that's the inverse square law, which is to say if you go n feet away, it's actually n feet squared brightness as you're going down. And that doesn't really lend itself very well to how our brain works. If you look at a light bulb, it looks like the light's just falling off completely smoothly. It looks like it's very bright at the light bulb and then just gets dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. Your brain is actually doing its own little gamma curve in your perception of what the world looks like. This is true not just of light, it's also true of hearing, it's true of pressure. If you put 1 pound in someone's hand, you won't notice a difference unless it's like an exponential difference. So if you put 20 pounds in someone's hand, you won't notice a 1 pound difference, but you will notice a 1 pound difference if you have a 1 pound. Same with decibels. When you're listening to sound, sound also follows this exponential fall-off curve. It's all over in the world because a lot of things in the world follow that curve. So your brain's perception of the world, you like to think of a gradient as 50% bright is at the middle, but that's not really true. Because if we're looking at 50% bright, it's actually all the way down here. So you imagine a gradient, and in a gradient in Photoshop, if you take the middle point of a gradient in Photoshop, it's going to tell you it's 50% brightness. And that's wrong. Really, it's going to be, if this was 1, and we're going, hold on, confuse myself here. So it's falling off exponentially, so it'll actually be 18% brightness all the way down here. Now, just looking at this curve, if you're storing data like this, you can see already there's a lot of a problem. So if these are values between 0 and 255, which is what you'll find in Photoshop, and this is 127, only like the first 10% of your gradient is going to be captured in the numbers 127 between 255. That's not terribly efficient. You're using, for the last 50% of your perceived brightness when you're looking at the screen, you're only dedicating the last 18% of your data. So that's what I mean when I say compression. That's why we still use the sRGB standard for everything, is it's just an efficient way to pack the data into the files so that you're not wasting all of this data on like the very top little bit of brightness. You're not wasting it on 90% brightness to 100% brightness with 80% of your data. So that's one of the new and contemporary reasons. Although it's not that good of a reason, just because like if you open a zip file, you don't have to do some weird math in your head to figure out what the contents of the words are. It just happens invisibly. So really, this is an engineering failing, that they should just be hiding all this from you in the background and compressing images however they want, and then you open it and it just looks right. But that's another complaint. Call Adobe, complain to Adobe. So that's just a technical thing, but like I said, you shouldn't really even have to worry about that. Just knowing that a gradient in Photoshop, it is a little helpful to be able to think about like, well, 50% gray is 50% gray, not like 50% gray, how I see it, is really 12.13% gray doing the conversions in your head. So there is a use, just for convenience, to be able to think of white is 100%, medium gray is 50%, 0 is 0%, without having to do that conversion in your head. But again, they could hide all that for you through code. The really important reason that I'm going to talk about gamma today, not the historical reason or the technical compression reasons, is the aesthetic reasons, the creative reasons. And for that, I got to log me back in. Okay. For that, we're going to also start getting into HDR. So for the last 60-odd years, all of our displays have been standard dynamic range displays. And what that means in practice is you can only display light between about what's called 0 nits and 100 nits. And a nit is just like how many photons per square foot there is. So 100 nits is like a movie theater screen, and 0 nits is obviously 0 photons, so you're not seeing anything on the screen. And that's not really how the real world works. That's not how, if you took a camera outside, you would, with a light meter, and you started measuring things, you'd very quickly realize that that white towel that's draped over a railing outside might be like 5,000 nits. And if you look at the sun, that's like 50,000 nits. It's going to be astronomically large scales compared to 100. And what a lot of video games do is, if this is our, I'm going to move our scale a little bit here to 1.0, again, parentheses, quote unquote, white, 1.0 white. They go up to white, and then they clip on the display. So you want your line to be pretty linear, because that's how we see the world. Everything in the world is linear. If I look at that light over there, it's going to be linear because it's the real world. If I look at a display, again, it's linear because it's the real world. That's kind of one of those misconceptions that your display is displaying in gamma space, but it's not, because if it had a gamma curve on it, it would look weird. It's part of the real world, so therefore it has to be linear. Everything in the real world is linear because you can't divide by photons on weird curves as they fly through the air. So if you're trying to cram 0 to 100 nits in here, you don't really have very many options. So what most people solve is they just clip it. So if you're playing Half-Life 2, and you go into a dark room, it says 0 to 1 white. Everything beyond white, it blooms it, does a nice little halo, glowy look to it. You go outside, it moves this whole window over here, and it says now you can see this, let's just say 100 to 200 nits. So a little bit more of the brightness. And it does that auto exposure thing is as you move in and out, it just clips the shadows and the highlights to try to give you the best cross-section of the real world that your display can display. And it looks bad. It looks like it was shot on an old iPhone. So that's HDR in the Half-Life 2 era. The other approach some people do is they apply localized tone mapping. And I've got an example, a lovely example of that here. Oops. Oh yeah, look at that nice naturalistic lighting in that scene. And you can do it through a post-process, but this post-process is really expensive. So what a lot of games will instead do is the lighters will just adjust the lighting. So you go outside and it's the same brightness as inside the room, which again looks strange because you don't have that contrast. You don't have those clues that it's not just bright, it's really, really bright outside, and the shadows aren't just dark, they're really, really dark by comparison to the direct sunlight. And that's why you end up with a lot of that kind of painterly look, like when people think that video games kind of look like a painting. It's also, I don't know what to call it, it's like the sitcom look, where if you're like watching a sitcom, you can look out their window and like outside, like there's a blue sky, and your brain's just kind of like, huh. Like it doesn't know what's wrong, it just knows that that's definitely filmed in a soundstage and the outside world is not the real world. And that's one of those clues of what they've done is instead of creating a world with the dynamic range of our world, they've just created this false world where it fits within the dynamic range of a television, which is not the world we live in. Again, it's kind of this theatrical look to it. The film industry has a much better solution, and they've been using it for the last 100 years. And that is film doesn't have, I lost my pen. Film itself doesn't have a linear sensitivity to it. It looks something more like this. It's got a little bit of a curve where it's like the activation energy, the little silver particles inside film, they just won't respond to light until it reaches a certain level. But there's different sizes of them, so the big ones respond earlier and the little ones take a lot longer. And what you end up with is this nice little curve, and then it goes into linear for a long time. And then some of them start clipping. So the big ones start clipping first, and then the smaller little ones can absorb much more light, so they take longer. And then it kind of does that at the top. So the end result is you can start with a world like this, and then it kind of bends it down to fit within white. That's a triple W there. That's interesting. White. And instead of just going hard black, it kind of eases it out so that your black blends in too. So in the middle, between here and here, you still have a pretty usable amount of range that's linear. It's responding as you would expect, brighter, 1 unit brighter equals 1 unit more exposure. And then it softens it off. And that's when you start loading up. Unreal Engine 4 now has this, Unity has this. When they have the film curves in the LUT selection, that's what they're doing. They're taking this giant dynamic range, and then instead of trying to localize sections that are bright and bring them down and sections that are dark and bring them up, they're just softening. They're just kind of taking the oomph out of it before it clips. And that ends up with a much more naturalistic image. But it also changes the way that you should be lighting. So I've got this example here. This is ASUS, and I'll mention ASUS a little bit later. Oops. There we go. So if we look at this image, this doesn't look great. The snow is completely clipping, the sun's completely clipping, but it's linear. It's a linear EXR, an ASUS EXR, and then it's being applied in sRGB gamma because the monitor, our projector here, is going to apply an inverse sRGB gamma. So if we don't give it an sRGB gamma, it'll go beyond linear to like sublinear. So what we're seeing right here is a perfectly linear image out within the limits of the projector. But obviously, we're not sitting on the edge of a glacier with glaring hot sun in our eyes and deep shadows. So that's, if you were sitting there, this is what you would see, but clipped. In other words, this is a nice, smooth image. But we want to see, this is ugly. We don't want to see the sun blown out. We want to see detail in the snow. This helicopter here is kind of getting lost in the flare. So the one thing we could do is just turn down our exposure. So this is the video game auto exposure. So there, now we can see the highlights on the helicopter. We can see detail in the snow. But now it's dark, so you don't really want to be playing a video game in daylight and it looks like it's some sort of moonlit scene. We've lost our creative intent, which was to have that mountain at about 50% gray and well exposed. So I'm going to turn the exposure back up, and if we hover over here, I'll just read off some values because you can't see them. Our sun is at around 2.5, 3. The snow down here is around 1.5 to 2.5. Actually, looks like our sun's getting closer to 4. So I've just done a basic little color lookup here. So this is just like, there we go. So as you can see, what I've done is for most of the image, and these are all linear values, these aren't sRGB corrected values. For almost all of our exposure, so here's our blue sky. You can see our blue sky is about there, all the way down to black. It's pretty much linear. 0.2 in, 0.2 out, 0.4 in, 0.4 out. It's still giving it that smooth image across the midtones, which was what our subject matter is. But as soon as we start getting above our into our highlights, it just gives this really long, smooth fall off all the way out to 3. And that will look like that. So let me put something. So it's a little hard to see on the projector, but 1, 2. So our main subject matter is remaining mostly the same. It still looks bright. It still looks well exposed. But we're just taking the edge off of the clip. So we're just softening that clip. And that's something you can do in any game engine with a lookup table or curves. It's extremely, extremely computationally light on the processor. And it still looks good. So I have another example here, too, of same thing. Here's a girl. If you look, the window is totally blown out. It's looking really contrasty, again, like a cheap camera. And there, just another one of these nice. Come on, double click. There we go. So again, very linear. We got a straight line, and then it just softens up. And the difference then is we recover all those highlights outside. So what we're doing is we're not lighting to ensure that nothing clips. If you're lighting to ensure that nothing gets above 100% white, you're going to either end up with a really dark image. So here's it lit to protect the outside world. So she's now really dark. So you're either doing that or you're letting it clip. which looks ugly. So you should let it clip. You should go for this kind of ugly image, but whenever you're working on your lighting, make sure you're working on your lighting with some sort of logarithmic tone curve that softens your highlights so that you can keep that nice contrasty real world look to it, but still end up with a pleasing image that's not blown out. So I'm going to just touch a bit on linear light and why also you should be rendering in linear light besides these nice examples of getting those free photographic look to it. And that's some other simple math. There you go here. And I'll subtitle this section, Why Photoshop is Awful. So if we have a gradient here, and I'm just going to express this as kind of like a little triangle where we have white. I'm not going to cross-hatch this or anything like that. And black over here. A lot of things that we'll do is we'll want to change the exposure. So exposure should be a very simple operation. If you have 1,000 photons and you want to be half as bright, you take away 500. So it should just be divided by 2 if you want to go down one quote-unquote stop of brightness. So we'll do that here. Let's say we're starting with 50% gray. And now let's say this is 50% gray sRGB. So this is Photoshop 50% gray. And we double it. We're going to end up with 100%. So we've gone immediately by doubling our light from 50% to 100% in a single quote-unquote stop. So a stop is just double the light, which is not how the real world works. If you go up one stop on your camera, if you go from like a 50th of a second to say a 25th of a second on your camera, the image will get like that much brighter. Just that, not 50% to 100, like eh. So I'll demo that in Nuke here in a second. And then if you go up, say, 200%, 2 stops, or 400%, 2 stops, you're going to be already so far beyond white that none of this really matters. And this really is important for things, especially like blur. If you have a little kernel here, one little pixel, and you blur it out to 16 pixels, let's take our 50% gray in sRGB again. Each of these is 50% gray divided by 16. Cortana. Help me out, Cortana. %. So each of these would be 3%. Now, theoretically, if you did 3% and you added it back together, you would come up to 50% again. But this is where things get really iffy inside of gamma-corrected math, because we have to remember, this isn't actually 50%. Remember, this is 18%. If you're looking at the light output, it's that. Our 50% is actually down here. So if you do 18% divided by 16, we're at about 1.6%. And now we need to do our gamma correction. So 1.6% on screen, we're going to do that, because it's all got to be corrected to look at. It's going to end up being a pretty low value. Let me see if I can do this real quick. So in gamma corrected space, this 1.6% sounds like nothing. It sounds like a very low number, but in gamma corrected space, it's actually going to be 36% gray. So we've gone from 50% spread out over 16 pixels, ending up at 3% in gamma corrected space, or we spread it out over 16 pixels in linear space and then gamma correct the result up. So this is just to the power of 1 divided by 2.2, if you're curious how I got that 36%. So once we gamma correct this value, it went from 18% down here, but this is the steepest part of the curve, so we've gone all the way up to 36%. So if you blur something inside of Photoshop, it's going to get really dark really fast, and that's not how real light works, because here we're preserving our total energy if we do it in linear space. If we start with 18%, our total energy is now 1.6%, and then gamma corrected, it ends up 36% on screen. And that's a factor of 10. So instead of ending up at 3% gray, you're ending up at 36% gray, which is a substantial difference. You see this a lot when you're doing things in Photoshop where people try to do blooms. They'll blur the whole image, and then they'll add it on top. They'll screen it over top of their image. That's what they're going to call their bloom, their glow, their HDR glow. And it's super bright. So they look at it and they go, well, this doesn't look good at all. This is, or it'll be really dark. It'll be 3%. They're like, this doesn't look good at all. I can't see this at all. So then they'll put a levels on it and they'll crank up the brightness to try to match what they're expecting the result to be, instead of just doing the math correctly in the first place, and you just magically end up where you wanted to be. So I'll do an example of that here in Nuke real quick. Oh, there's a mouse. There we go. So we've done two blurs, and they look, and I've had to adjust the amount of blur here. So as you can see here, this is the exact same operation. I'm doing everything exactly the same. This is in linear space. You can see we're getting a really nice glint up here. It's kind of falling off how you'd expect it to look. And this is now trying to do it already inside gamma space. We've lost a large amount of the blur. It's almost entirely gone. So now I got to come in here and try to turn up the amount, this brightness. And now it's gotten just kind of overall softer. So now you kind of look like you put Vaseline on the lens. Instead of getting a bloom, you're getting 80s soap opera Lifetime movie. And again, if we go back to our linear version, turn it down to a similar amount of bright blur, we're still getting those nice strong blooms, but it's not changing her face a lot. It's only around the highlights. So that's another thing people do. They say, well, I don't want it to look like a soap opera. So what they start doing then is they take their blur, and you've probably been here if you've ever done blurring in Photoshop to create a bloom. You then put levels on your blurred layer, and you say, well, I don't want it in the shadows. So you crush the blacks on your bloom layer, and you crank up the brightness because it's too dark. And you end up then with weird saturation issues because you've been playing with your levels, and you know if you play with levels and increase contrast in Photoshop, you can get a more saturated image, and so on and so forth. So instead of, again, if you just do everything in linear light space, it all just works, because you're not, if you have 100 photons and you divide it by 2, you have 50 photons. If you have 1,000 photons and you divide it by 2, you have 500 photons. You're not trying to correct all of the weirdness from being in this gamma space. You're just adding things together. So a really good example of that is exposure. So here I'm going to increase the exposure by 100%. So it's brighter, but it's not insanely brighter. Now I'm going to do the same thing in gamma space. You can also see we're getting, I don't know if you can see it on the projector, but already in gamma 1, this is getting way more saturated up here. It's wrong. It's bad. So I'm going to do the same operation, turn it back down to the original exposure, and I'm going to multiply everything by 2. So again, we should just be increasing by 1 stop, and we've lost the image. So what I like to say is, if there's not an optical equivalent in the real world, if you can't do it to your camera, don't do it in gamma corrected space. So your camera is a real world device that really captures images, because the real world is the realest thing you can find. Don't do it. But that's not to say you shouldn't actually do things in gamma space. There are useful areas, and that is, if you're wanting to do color correction, it's really weird, like I said earlier, in your brain to work with this kind of curve in your head. Some things like saturation, don't do in linear light space. Whatever you do not increase saturation in linear light space. Let's see if we can do an example of that on her face. So there's no optical filter. You can't go down to your local camera store and say, I want a saturation filter. Like, you're not going to find one. You can't take the real world and say, I want this wavelength of light, but more of it, depending on how much of it there is. Like, that's, maybe we invent some crazy exotic metamaterial in the year 2030, we can do that kind of thing. But it's not like a red filter. It's not just like a green filter. It's a signal. I refer to it as signal filtering. It's a digital filter. So I'm just going to increase the contrast by double here. That's too much. But you can see what's already happened. This is double saturation. Her face has changed colors. Like, it hasn't stayed the same brightness. It's actually changed colors. And that's because we're violating the laws of nature, and it's rebelling. And you end up with crazy, weird artifacts. But I'm going to copy and paste the saturation and do the same thing now in gamma space. And I'm not annotating, but so you can see what I'm doing here is just I'm taking it, everything in Nuke is in linear space, so I'm bumping it into gamma space, doing my thing, and then sending it back to linear, because secretly it's adding the curve for me, helpfully in the background. That's just what's going on there. So it still doesn't look great, but it looks exactly the same on the projector. Let's see if we can. Oh, it didn't change. That's why it looks exactly the same. I missed. There we go. Yeah, it's subtle on the projector, but it looks really bad on displays. It actually looks pretty much okay on the LCD monitor. So there's challenges on your display stuff. So I guess just take my word for it. It does. You can kind of see like the back, the seats at least are going into that weird orangish. Whereas this is the sRGB one, and it's looking okay-ish. It's pretty extreme, but it's looking acceptable-ish. You wouldn't want to push it this way anyways. So if there's a non-photographic equivalent, by all means, feel free to do it in gamma space. One really popular one is curves. So again, if you have this really steep curve, trying to do curves in linear space is really hard. Because one, your brain doesn't think that way. You think between 0 and white as being this defined space instead of this like infinite huge space with values that get up to 100. But a lot of color correctionists, when they're working on like feature films, they'll convert it to what's called log space. And that's just a really flat, really strong gamma curve. And then they round out the contrast. And that just kind of works more with like 50% gray is at the middle, as opposed to like 50% gray is most of the way to the left. And it helps your brain. So if it helps your brain, by all means, you can work in those spaces whenever you're doing something that's not photographic. So if your game engine has like a weird film LUT that you want to like make kind of a cool Instagram look to it, it's probably not an optical effect, it's a color correction effect, so feel free to do that in gamma. If you're doing something that is photographic, like changing your exposure or doing a blur or anything like that, do it in linear space because those are all optical effects that you're trying to emulate. And if you do them in gamma space, you're going to end up with weird artifacts that you have to later fix. And that's pretty much everything that I've got to say about this. Oh, HDR. I just wanted to throw in there. So HDR is really easy with linear color space because if we say, oops, I'll do it the other way. If we say that 100 nits is white for SDR, and to fix that, to do SDR, we just go whoop and level it off to stay under white. HDR, let's say you have an 1000 nit. That's a pretty standard HDR TV, which would be 10.0, by the way. So that's 10 times brighter than standard dynamic range. If you have 1000 nits and your scene does go to 2000 nits in your game, you still just do whoop and you just level it off. So you just kind of take an exit ramp at whatever your display can handle. If your display can handle 100 nits, you just round it off to 100 nits. If your display can handle 1000 nits, go all the way up to 800 nits and then just round it off so you don't get that hard clip. All you're really trying to do is just soften the clipping and compress what data you can't display into it while keeping everything else linear. So don't do this to your HDR images and then just boost up the brightness. That's not what we're trying to do with HDR. Don't even take an image that looks like, oops. Don't even take an image that looks like this and boost it in HDR. What you really want to actually do is the image that looks more like this, but 10 times brighter. So it's still linear all the way through the image, it's just 10 times brighter. So the brights are actually bright, the midtones are actually mid, and this is something that a lot of games aren't doing yet. Just for the sake of efficiency, they're rendering everything through the same pipeline. So they're rendering it out with that curve where they're already rounding it off, and then they're kind of undoing it in their frame buffer. So they get to here where they've already rounded off those clipped highlights, and then they're kind of taking the clipped highlights area, and instead of, they're taking this rounded off image, and then they're kind of just bending that curve up as best as they can, which has different degrees of success depending on the game. And also the lighting. So really we need to start thinking, because they've already lit a lot of the scenes. For instance, the biggest offender I just played was Tomb Raider. Tomb Raider has decided that a lot of their caves are about the same brightness as a fully lit day scene, so that they wouldn't have to do auto exposure or anything. So in HDR, you're just looking into a cave, and you should see a really bright sky, and then the cave being normal, dark. And as you go in, your eyes, your pupils should be adjusting. So as you go into a cave, you don't need auto exposure on HDR. You just display it dark. And outside, you just display it bright. And then it just looks good. So I encourage you all, because by the time you're going to be in the industry working on these games that are coming out in 2 to 3 years, almost everything's going to be HDR, probably natively. You're going to have these 32-bit frame buffers that you're rendering to, and you're going to be happy about it. And we need to start thinking about how to target this. So again, we don't want to light like a sitcom where the world is crammed into 1950s television capabilities. And we don't want to try to do target sRGB and then undo it later in the process. We just want to take this one native image, and then depending on your display, you output it. And there's a bunch of standards that are coming out this way. The biggest one is called ASIS. So you might start dealing with ASIS right now. And ASIS is just EXRs if you've worked with EXRs. So it's this floating point linear light. And then, and it looks just like this. This is a ASIS image. So you can see it's clipped on my standard definition display. But it's got a bunch of standards, so you don't even have to do anything. This is what I'm talking about, like you shouldn't have to think about it. And thankfully you don't with ASIS. It's got built-in displays. So you say, I have a 100-nit display, and it says, great, here's the best I can do. You've given me a lot of data, here's the best I can do. Or you say, I have 1,000 nits. Same image, it just goes, great, here's the best I can do. And that's how we should be doing it. We should be rendering the full range of the world and then letting the TV just adapt to whatever it's able to handle. And the thing that kind of goes along with that too is color. So we've also had red. Again, I'm going to use air quotes here. Red isn't very red on TVs. It's kind of a 50% red. And with HDR, another thing we're doing is we're going to those really saturated reds. So a lot of cameras, what they'll do is instead of rendering the world, which has really red reds, it'll take the saturation curve and it'll just round off that saturation curve. It says, oh, your TV can't handle super red reds. Instead of clipping the saturation, I'm just going to round off that saturation, just like we're doing with luminance. And that's great. That's how all the cinema cameras work, and they work really well. But they're still capturing that really wide dynamic saturation, not just dynamic light, but also dynamic saturation. And your games can start using that a lot more too. So you won't have to cram into your textures just 8 bits worth of saturation. You're going to have like 16 bits of saturation. And that's part of the HDR standard as well, which is, I think, one of the more exciting parts of the HDR standard that people don't really know a lot about. They know it's a brighter TV, but again, it shouldn't just be a brighter TV. It should be the same image by and large, just with just the highlights that we've been historically rounding off. Just those should be brighter. And it shouldn't be a more saturated TV. It should be pretty much the same picture, because that's the real world, just wider range. Yeah, so for the wider range of saturation. You should be able to get, most of the world fits into a standard TV, but HDR should let you just keep going further. So don't try to think of HDR as something that's like, oh, it's going to be way more, everything's going to be like twice as saturated and everything's going to be twice as bright. Like, that's not the goal we should be going for. The goal is it should be like a normal TV and then a little extra on top. So it should be like sprinkles and frosting, not just across the board handled as if it was just, oh, I can do twice as much, so I'm going to do twice as much. And that is Gamma. Any questions?
Is there any like recent films you think like either missed the mark with their lighting or like did a really good job of like having it well balanced throughout?
I saw the Dolby Vision, and Dolby Vision is one of the HDR standards. The newest or second newest Star Wars movie, and that one, like the lightsabers look gorgeous, like those bright red lightsabers. And again, they did a really good job. It looked realistic. Like the world looked realistic. It looked like a normal movie, which TV manufacturers hate. Like they hate that their new standard isn't obvious from 500 feet across the aisle, or like, oh wow, that TV over there is 3 times more saturated than all the other ones. Like, that's bad TV. So they did a really nice natural, it's kind of like 3D TVs and 3D cinema. Like 3D is really nice when it just looks like a normal movie but has some depth to it, as opposed to making it all about the 3D-ness of it. So that's kind of like, I think, a really well done high dynamic range movie recently.
So just to clarify, like linear workflow is pretty much just you just put the curve correction on it and then you can just go from there, right?
Yeah, linear workflows, honestly, it should be easier than gamma corrected workflow. Yeah, you just load the EXR in, for instance. It's already in linear. You do all the rendering, should all be linear. You do your compositing, it should just be linear. And then the very last second before you send it to your monitor, you should be able to send it to your monitor linear, but monitors are just assuming everything has already been gamma corrected. You give them their obligatory gamma correction because that's what they want, and then they undo it inside the monitor and give you back a linear image. So really, it should be from beginning to end. Your camera should capture linear because linear light's coming into it from the real world. You should view it on your monitor in linear. You should do all your color correcting stuff pretty much in linear. And then you should just send a linear image out to your TV, which should then send out a linear light back to your eyeballs. So if you have a camera and you have a TV, you should be able to stand there and look at the real world and look at the TV, and they should just look exactly the same. Because at no point should anything have changed. The only reason you should ever change something is if you need to. So if your TV can't handle one of the highlights in the background, yeah, round it off. But up until that point, try to preserve as much about the real world as you possibly can.
Cool.
That's it.
Wrap it up, yeah. So, yeah, give Gavin a hand, everyone. Cool, thank you.